This is the InCamera podcast with me, Alvin Tejo, the big city podcast about big city problems and big city solutions. Experience is something that we all look for in our elected leaders. We want to see that they've been through challenges and come out better on the other side. This week's guest is John Tory, the former mayor of Toronto. And throughout his career, he's worn many hats. He's a lawyer, a broadcaster, a business leader, and if you remember his Black and Gold Raptors jacket, he's really into sports. Politically, he was principal secretary to Premier Bill Davis in the 80s. He ran a federal party campaign in the 90s, and he was leader of the Ontario PCs from 2004 to 2009. John has a wealth of experience inside and outside of government before becoming mayor of Toronto in 2014. In our conversation today, I talked to John about the challenges he had as mayor and how big cities can get big things done. We also talk about how we can work together with the federal and provincial government of any stripe to deliver for our communities. And now, our in-camera conversation with John Tory. John, I actually had a really tough time in preparing for this interview based on your life experience. You've done so many incredible things, and you've had an incredible journey. And so I'll just say thank you for your public service, and thank you for coming on to the podcast today.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I often say, Alvin, and thank you for having me, Councillor. When I visit colleges and student groups, I'll say to them, if you have the chance to have, 4 or 5 different careers, and in my case, it was all opportunistic. People would say to me, "Well, have you ever thought of doing a talk show?" And I thought, no, I haven't actually. I went to law school, and I didn't think of doing a talk show, but all those things have contributed to an interesting life, and I never got bored. And so I'm just happy I had a chance to do all those things.
Well, with all your various life experiences, I do want to focus on the political side of it. And I do know you have a lot of experiences at every level of government. You've run a federal election for the PCs, Principal Secretary to Premier Bill Davis for 4 years, which was an incredible time for Ontario. And obviously, your runs in Ontario and Toronto. But I'd like to start locally before we move up the orders of government, because I always saw your time in office as mayor as one of big ideas. You put forward a lot of things. You put forward things like Smart Track. You were really aggressive in trying to make change. But you also brought a time of what I would say is stability and good governance. Right, the city was kind of chaotic before you came in. But I kind of wanted to start with your challenges in the mayor's office as a businessman who had a lot of experience, running large organizations, and sort of the differences in municipality.
The biggest, challenge that you face and the biggest difference. I mean, when you're the CEO of a company and you say something's going to happen, it generally happens. Because people figure, well, okay, there is one boss, as it were, and people give you advice and people do this and do that, but in the end, what you want happens maybe as modified. When you are and I'm not complaining about this, I'm just stating it as an observation. When you are the mayor of a city under our system in Ontario, where now they've given some strong mayor powers to mayors, but when you're there, you're basically there to seek consensus with the council, and I think there's a lot to be said for that, especially in a non-party kind of environment. But it means you have to work all the time at seeking consensus and whatnot, which isn't a bad thing, but it's just a reality, and it takes longer. And I think the second thing is that the municipal system, which I think is a flaw, has the ability for people to just stand up and move a motion. Certainly that's true at the Toronto Council. I think it's true in many other councils, where you can move a motion and your colleagues can decide sometimes at the tail end of a meeting with 8 minutes to go, and it becomes policy, and nobody's studied it, nobody's looked at it, nobody's looked at the cost. They just do it, and I think that is not right, and it's not good, and that does not happen in the parliamentary system. Some people say that system is too slow, and I'd say, well, yeah, there are times when the local system is too fast. So, look, every order of government has its flaws, but it's just difficult to bring about change. And the public service are there, and I'm not one who is going to say they're an obstruction to anything. I think they are incredibly professional. Certainly all the ones I dealt with, both provincially and municipally, are incredibly professional. But, their job is also, nowadays, it seems, to prevent mistakes from being made. I think that's everybody's job, and I think that's to a fault. People are now paranoid about making a mistake and being written up in the paper and being castigated in social media, so everybody's very cautious, and that means you end up taking time, and you hire more consultants than you need to hire to sort of back up what should be fairly elementary decision-making on the part of both public servants and politicians.
Maybe let's dive into like a specific type of project, because Smart Track has essentially evolved in a lot of different ways now, right? It's now a number of different stations. Some of it's part of the Ontario line. how do you feel that cities can have a better process in terms of doing big things like this?
You know, the fact is, I don't want to sound defeatist or anything about this, not negative, but the reality is that the biggest reason why Smart Trek didn't happen as it was originally conceived, and I'm not saying it was perfect or that it should have happened just exactly as written down, because I wrote it down when I was not in office, and you don't have the resources to answer all the questions and so on. But the biggest thing that caused it to change was a change in provincial government and a change in provincial transit plans.
Right.
And, you know, those other governments, meaning provincial and federal, are the ones with the money. And so at the end of the day, when it comes to a major transit project, whatever they say will generally go, because if they don't agree with it, they won't pay for it. And so when Premier Ford came along and decided, instead of, you know, the Smart Track per se, and instead of what Toronto called the relief line, and the same thing I know happened here in Peel, that we would have X, Y, and Z, which is like the Ontario line, and then the western part of the line that goes to the airport inside Toronto. That's what happened, because he had the money. And so, I, by the way, you know, I was a signatory to the agreement that ultimately said, yes, we're going to build that $40 billion worth of transit, because I thought that the job for us was, as mayor, the job here and the job for you and the job for everybody is find a way to get it done. And you have to do that with the other two governments because they have more of the money. And so, you know, that's why those things get modified in many cases, though, because of a change of mayor, a change of government, the passage of time, and on it goes, and things rarely end up exactly as proposed. But the point is, did you get something done to move people in the case of transit, or to create a park, or to do something like that? Did you get something done?
Yeah.
Maybe not exactly what you said, and that's really, I think, the litmus test.
Well, and I think it's been successful in terms of, you know, the transit city that we're building.
It has. I mean, people will say it was nothing. It's nothing to do with it, but they would say it had nothing to do with Doug Ford either, and I would disagree. Or Justin Trudeau. I mean, people love to not like Justin Trudeau in hindsight, but I mean, if what hadn't been for him and his commitment, and Doug Ford and his commitment to getting a transit plan, and me, we wouldn't have had a transit plan. And it's all under active construction now, as there are many things under construction out here in Peel that wouldn't have happened if the leaders of the day hadn't agreed.
What do you think some of the challenges are with these projects and their timelines? Because, I mean, the political will is there, the money is there, but, I mean, you look at the Eglinton LRT, 14,
It's a
15
great
years.
mystery to me, really, because I look at other countries. Look, I understand in the case of China, they don't have labor laws and environmental laws and so on, so I guess it's easy to get things done faster if you have fewer rules. But there are other countries, many others, including some very close by, that seem to get things
In
done
Europe,
faster than us. Yeah.
Paris.
And I don't really get it. Like, I never really did understand. I mean, I thought some of it was, you know, government moving slowly and tentatively for the reasons I mentioned earlier, and the multiple, you know, kind of orders of government that have to agree to pay for these things. Some of it, I think maybe from time to time, the private sector kind of fighting with itself. Certainly in the case of some of the transit projects that I oversaw when I was mayor, they were busy fighting with each other, the companies building it, as opposed to fighting with the government. We knew what we wanted. We just wanted the transit built. And so ultimately, in the case of, say, the subway extension that goes up to York University, which many of the listeners and viewers will be familiar with, we just had to hire another company, pay them. It cost millions of dollars to do it, to get it done. We just said, get it done. That's your job. And we got it done, and it opened. So I don't know, but I mean, there's something fundamentally wrong, you know, with our system overall that says that it takes us seemingly twice as long and costs seemingly, I won't say twice as much, but a lot more for us to get these things done compared to many other places. Leave China aside.
On housing, because housing seems to be something that's been a challenge right now. I know the conditions aren't necessarily ideal for buyers or for developers, but cities seem to be slower in terms of being able to be as nimble to allow more housing and to actually get the housing built.
Yeah, and I think there's two aspects to that. I mean, the first is inside the government, like in the public service, there was, certainly in the case of Toronto, there were 15 departments that had a say in every housing. And then, well, they should, the traffic department and the, public works and, on it goes. And they would seemingly sort of send things in circulation, even with technology, and every time there was one change, everybody had to sign off. And this just extended the period of time out, immeasurably, and it just isn't an efficient way to do things. And when they didn't actually sit at the same table and be accountable to each other across the table, it was too easy to kind of let things go for months and years. And so I think that is a factor for sure in terms of the time it takes. And I think the other is, I'll call it NIMBYism. I don't like to call it that because it's not always that, but just people who raise an objection about anything.
Yeah.
No
change.
We need probably in the city of Mississauga, but also for sure, I know in the city of Toronto, a lot more mid-rise development.
Yep.
And there are people who will just say no, like that's too close to my neighborhood, and mid-rise is
We
no
have the
good.
two opposites.
Yeah, and it's on a major
two-story
street,
and
and so they're either happy, not happy. They're never happy with a 50-story
Right,
tower if it's
right.
far away from them. They're okay, but if it's close and it's a 50-story tower, or it's a 2-story, single-family home, and there's got to be lots of housing in between in this day and age, and with the kind of density that we have. And so I think those are the two principal problems: lack of coordination inside the public service, and then activism, if I'll call it that. It's not a bad thing, but it's just when it's activism to stop everything from happening that represents change, it means it slows things down.
It's the missing middle
Yeah.
that we need to get,
Yeah.
right? We've seen a lot of other cities be able to do that we haven't been able to do.
I've heard in Toronto now, for example, and I have no idea if it's happening here or not, that a year and a half away, more than a year and a half from the next election, there are people already slowing projects down because they're concerned about the political impact of them.
Right.
And it used to be the case there was kind of 6 or 8 months before the election when it was a sensitive time, and so you might have things that would be put off for another day. But when it gets to be a year and a half or forever and all the time that you're just putting stuff off because it's not popular or because somebody might be upset about it, that's when you get everything bogged down. And we need the housing badly, we need the transit badly, we need all this stuff. And if it's not getting built and approved, then it's not getting built.
I know you were friends with the late Hazel McCallion, and she would always say that the federal government has all the money, the province has all the power, and the municipalities have all the problems.
Oh my goodness! And I used to talk. We talk about this often, but she and I loved her. I mean, because I had some encounters with her, as you know, that were epic. But having said that, the number of instances in which all governments of all parties, provincially, not so much federally, change the rules, on cities and impose obligations on cities, but never send any money.
Yep.
And then people wonder
give
why
us
there's
tools.
why there's pressure on their taxes, their local taxes, because increasingly and wrong in my view, especially when it comes to social policy, which was social policy was left with the provinces for a very deliberate reason because they had the income generating tools, income tax, sales tax, corporate taxes to generate more money that grew with the economy. Cities don't. I mean, they have, basically property taxes, and in the odd time, Toronto was fortunate enough to get a land transfer tax, which made a difference. I mean, without that, I think the city of Toronto would have had serious financial problems, more serious, many years ago. But that's what the province, and it's easy for them to pass a law saying we're going to do some social justice here, in a few minutes at the legislature, and we all feel good about that. And then it has nothing to do with them actually implementing it or paying for it.
Yeah.
And they don't send any money. It's not fair, and it's not right. And that is part of what's been said for decades now, which is that has to be rethought. And of course, nobody in the province ever really wants to rethink it.
No, they want to keep the power. And sometimes even when they do give you the tools and you decide you either want to toll the garden or whatever it is, they come in and tell you can't do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that was frustrating for me, and I know people here in Mississauga and Peel and parts of 905 were unhappy at the proposal of tolling those expressways. But the reality was that we had these very expensive expressways, which have now been taken over by the province. But we had them. We had to absorb the entire cost. Toronto taxpayers did of maintaining them and operating them, and half the ridership on them or drivership on them was from 905. And so I understood completely why people were upset from this part of the region. But at the same time, we're left sitting there saying, well, we've got this thing and half the people that are using it. It'd be like as if half the people, in fact, this argument applies from time to time too, but the transit system, the taxpayers of Toronto heavily subsidize their own transit system, but it's used by people who are not living in Toronto and paying any taxes.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where that shouldn't be the argument. The argument should be that we all share together regionally and provincially in these things that make for a prosperous province. Because the province is ultimately the beneficiary of these things.
Absolutely.
The city isn't.
Yeah.
I mean, the city benefits too, but so does the province.
And residents don't understand how the system works, and
No.
they think we have the ability to do all these things. And we always talk about how we don't have that ability, we don't have these powers. And no other city has the same, City of Toronto Act, so we don't have the same powers that even Toronto had. And we've been talking about that. How do we get even what Toronto is able to get, and will you let us do it? Otherwise, you keep downloading these other responsibilities, whether it's social services, whether it's transit, and that makes it almost impossible for us to move on big projects. 'Cause we
Now,
have
I don't
the
want to wade
resources.
into what may be a sensitive issue out here in Mississauga, but, I think Mr. Ford, when he created the Strong Mayor Powers, was doing something in that kind of direction, but then he was leaving it to one man or one woman to make the decision to, in effect, override the wishes of the duly elected council. And again, I've always argued there was some legitimacy to that because the mayor of any city is the only one elected across the city,
That's right.
and so therefore can take a citywide view of these things. But at the same time, it's just a very clumsy way.
Yeah.
Whereas if the city itself had some of these powers, like the whole city, the council and the mayor, you could make decisions more, effectively. Or if you had the money, I mean, I don't care if they want to say, fine, we're going to give you this responsibility, then just give us the money, give cities, give us the money to carry these things out, and that's fine. I have no problem with that. I often think that, and the pandemic, I think, proved it in spades, that the level of government best suited to administer many, many things is local government.
Absolutely.
Because you know the area, you know the people, everybody that knows the people, and the governments themselves are just closer to the people. So I have no problem with the cities being asked to do things, but don't make them pay.
So on strong mayor powers, do you think it's working?
I think it is, because I haven't heard of people sort of running roughshod and using them every second afternoon. I mean, if that was happening, I'd say, well, that's making a farce of the system.
Right.
But I think it is. I mean, in my own case, I sort of said I wasn't going to use them much, but people knew I had them. So it was one of those things where almost the sort of the threat of using them, not a threat, but the fact you had them caused people to think in a more conciliatory manner. But I think we have to watch it very carefully and sort of see, because I don't think they were intended even by Premier Ford to be used like on a routine basis. It's not right. I mean, you do have a council that's there for a reason, and they're duly elected too, and so on. So I think I wouldn't say it's not working. I think for the moment it seems to be sort of something where it's a work in progress, and I wouldn't say it's kind of out of control bad.
So, you're a provincial leader as well. Now, after your experience in municipal government, how would you suggest or recommend to someone like Premier Ford to adjust to make this relationship better and give municipalities the ability to manage their affairs?
Well, I would say, number one, give them the ability to manage their affairs, and sort of reserve intervening for what I'll call, highly unusual circumstances. There are times when the province should intervene in areas of local jurisdiction if there's something going on that's highly unusual, number one. And number two, sit down and negotiate, not some ad hoc thing that's going to be, we'll trade you an expressway for some money, and that was
doing.
fine. It was all good that he did that in the sense that was to the benefit of the city, and he took over an expressway which was the only one of its kind, that and the Don Valley Parkway that were being run by a city anyway. But do a deal that's a permanent deal, and I would say where that might start, frankly, is with saying you're going to provide, as was done in the old days meaning back say 30 or 40 years ago, operating funding for transit systems. If you believe you need to move people around, if you believe, as Mr. Ford does, there's a traffic problem, one of the answers, not the only answer, is more transit. And he's building it, to give him his due, with money from the feds,
they're paying for
too.
the capital, but the
the operating part,
yeah.
I mean, so I'm sure it's going to be true here with the, what is it called, the LRT here.
The Hazel
The minute you take it over,
Yeah.
I mean, you are dealing with an operating subsidy you have to put in every single year. And you can't raise fares, beyond a certain level. And so say, no, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to help with that because we believe that is in the best interest of the province and the biggest cities in the province, including Mississauga.
But it does seem like they want to do it ad hoc, project by project and city by city. So they've given Toronto the New Deal.
Yeah.
They did it with Ottawa. We're the third largest city. They haven't done it with us.
No, but and it should be done here. And that's why it shouldn't be done that way, though, because you get these instances where you have the third biggest city that has no such deal and has got major transit going on and needs that transit. And so they should have a deal. And nobody sort of can bring themselves to actually sit down and make the commitment and say it's a long-term deal. It's not something for a year or for a term or for a week. It's a long-term deal, and it applies to everybody. Everybody, say, who has a major transit system. I mean, that's fine. That'd be about 8 or 10 cities, probably maximum.
Well, and we're the ones subsidizing it, right? We're
Right.
subsidizing every ride. So
Right.
even, Toronto taxpayers are subsidizing our rides when we're going into Toronto. So, that's a big challenge. But on transportation and speaking about the Premier, he has a lot of, I guess I'll say, sort of anecdotal evidence of what he thinks works and doesn't work. There was the conversation on bike lanes. There's the tunnel under the 401. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts of these are, either on bike lanes or the tunnel, but I'm curious as to.
Well, I mean, some of the bike lanes that are being argued about are bike lanes that I oversaw the installation of when I was mayor, and I think some of them, I think what you need to have in a city is a network that's sensible, kind of that runs north, south, east, west, so you can go any which way. It should be done where it's sensible to do it. It should be separated bike lanes so that people are safe. But it was clear to me that the ones on Bloor Street West were not working, and so therefore the notion they might be taken out. This is Bloor Street West, close to here, closer to here than downtown. It is clear to me that the ones on Bloor and on University Avenue downtown, from lots of people from here have, I'm sure, experienced them one way or the other, were working. And so, to me, again, this is part of what happens when you get into a wholesale saying, "Oh, we're going to tear them all out," and that's that. I mean, some of them were working, and can you find better ways to do things? Of course, all the time. Can you even find sometimes a better place to put bike lanes? Of course. But I think there was a lot of thought put into where those are onto wider streets that could accommodate, um, the bike lanes. And the fact is that while, yes, we have a winter climate and so on, there are many, many more people. You go down and stand now on Bloor Street. I was there before I came here today. And there are many, many, many people, as the weather gets better, that are using cycling to get around. I've said to Premier Ford before, we have a bike share program, as I'm sure you do here. The fact that the bike share program, even while I was mayor over 9 years, went up in the millions of rides as we kept expanding
it.
It
was like 10x.
Yeah, it does indicate that there's a lot of people riding bikes.
Yeah.
And even if they're riding it in a short span between one place and another inside a neighborhood. So again, it's to me, there's not a black or white answer. It's a sort of a sensible, I used to say safe, sensible bike lanes, and the sensible
Separated,
included where they are separated. And so I think things like that, I wouldn't necessarily qualify it, even though I know it's politically popular, as an area where the province should be intervening all over with cities and starting to redirect that kind of thing. Traffic is a huge problem. And so, in that sense, I understand what Premier Ford did. We'll see where it ends up in terms of how many bike lanes are actually torn out. But I would have said those decisions, by and large, should be made locally.
Do you have an opinion on the tunnel?
Well, the tunnel, look, I have no problem with him. I mean, I think one thing about Premier Ford, and I know him quite well now, really well, is that he's willing to look at anything and sort of say, as much as you sort of think, that it sounds like an outrageous idea costing an outrageous amount of money. I'm sure they said that about the big dig in Boston and, various things over time, but those that you chose to go ahead with, in many cases, people are now wiping their brow and saying, thank God somebody did that, 25 years ago. So I'd say, well, fine, look at it. I just think the cost is going to end up being, kind of prohibitive. And of course, we all know, back to our earlier discussion, that isn't just the cost you start out with, it's the cost you finish with and the timeline you finish with. But I don't think there's a harm in looking at it. The 407, which a lot of, again, of your listeners and viewers will use, has a transit corridor right along it. Is there any opportunity there to do something? I'm not sure what I'm talking about, with whether it's transit or whether it's even more roads. But there's a transit corridor that was set aside by the government, and it's in public hands.
Right.
Maybe that represents an answer, because, but I wouldn't criticize them for looking at the tunnel, even though I think in the end it'll prove not to be feasible.
No, and to your point, I think you're trying to build networks that give people alternatives.
Yeah.
Right? So whether they want to drive or take transit or ride a bike or walk, you want them to consider those options, and it makes all the systems better, right? It'll make traffic better. For
everyone. And I'm one of those who, and I think it's just reality. It's not me being any kind of a smart guy. I recognize the fact that there are going to be some people, including especially trucks that deliver things, that will always be using roads. I mean, there used to be some councillors who would stand up and sort of say, "Oh, this whole car thing and this whole truck thing, it's all going the way of the dodo bird." And I'm thinking, no, I mean, that's really not feasible. But so you have to be balanced about it, and that's what I always tried to do.
So just maybe going back to your time as a provincial leader, I know you had some interactions with our late mayor, Hazel McCallion. Are there any fun stories you want to share there?
I've told the story, and I told it many times publicly, but not here and not for a while since she's been gone. We miss her. But she would be one who would call you. And, I didn't stand on ceremony when I was the leader of the opposition, but that's an important job in our parliamentary system, and I'm not sure it's less or more important than being mayor of Mississauga or mayor of anywhere else. But she would call me, and with Hazel, there was never any mistaking. She would just call you and say, "You got to come out here to see me." And there was no kind of, "Would you mind coming out?" or "I'll meet you halfway," or "I'll come to Queen's Park." It was, "You got to come out here to see me."
Yeah.
So, when those calls came, and there was more than one, I would come, and it was out of respect in part for the fact that she was such a senior person in the sort of whole government apparatus. And the one in particular I remember was one where she told me that I should vote against a given piece of legislation, and if she didn't, she would tear me limb from limb, or see that I suffered a terrible fate. And I sort of sat there and listened to her and left her office, and then I went downstairs, and my car was gone. And so for years I got up at public functions and said that she'd had my car towed. Like that was her way of sort of saying, and in case you didn't understand what I said up in my office, when you come downstairs and your car's gone.
Right.
And I'm sure she didn't, but and she used to laugh. She'd just look at me and kind of go, you'll never know.
Yeah.
And for years thereafter, by the way, when she was in Toronto, and Bonnie Crombie and Frank Scarpitti from Markham, and they were at a public function in Toronto, and I was up on the podium, I'd say, "Oh, by the way, you parked illegally when you arrived here, and I'm afraid your car's been towed away." Because I just was fascinating on that, and sort of, and for a minute they would wonder if I was serious the first time I did it.
Well, she had a very distinctive car. She had Mayor 1 as a
Oh, I know.
license plate.
Look,
and-
I also saw her drive. That's another.
Yeah.
I can tell you stories about that. And I came out a few times when I was a provincial leader to the what's the event called? And it's a really nice event. It was held kind of in a big plaza parking lot, and she came. And they were cooking pancakes, and it was on a nice spring morning, say in June. Anyway, it's an event that's well known. It's been on forever.
Right.
And she would arrive driving herself, which was
Yep.
like a frightening concept. And then she'd pull into the parking space and sort of crash into one of those things that's on the ground that
Yep.
marks out the parking spaces, and you'd hear this crash. Sort of, it wasn't doing any particular damage to her car, but you say, "Oh, Hazel's here," and but that was Hazel.
Asking a little bit of your advice, because right now for Pierre Poilievre and for Bonnie Crombie, they're leaders who are sitting outside the legislature. You spend a little bit of time for that. Do you have any advice for them?
Well, just keep busy. Don't let yourself, and don't let yourself get trapped into. I'm one of those people who obviously believes in the extreme importance of the legislature and of councils. They're parliamentary bodies that make decisions, and people are elected there. But at the same time, I think you can get yourself bogged down in that very artificial world of the legislature or parliament or city council. And if you spend too much time there, so I would have said if you have the circumstance that has led you not to be a member of that body, then go and travel the province and talk to real people and be on the local media and learn about the issues, rather than standing around out in front of the legislative chamber waiting for the chance you might get 30 seconds on TV, which half the time you wouldn't anyway.
Right.
And so I just say, and then get into the legislature as soon as you can. But in the case of Bonnie Crombie, I mean, she has a 4-year term ahead of her. It's a long time. Mm-hmm. And if you said to me, well, is there an urgency, given that she's also not the official opposition, for her to be in the legislature, maybe getting a question here or there and maybe getting on TV asking it? I'd say no. I mean, it's go and travel the province. Have people see that you're out there listening to them, learning about them, and do that. And I did that because first I didn't have any choice, but secondly, we concluded that it wasn't a worthwhile expenditure of time to sort of hang around outside the doors of the legislature. So I think that's all I would say to them. Mr. Poilievre is following a different approach in that, as we know, he's had somebody vacate their seat, and Mr. Carney said he's going to call a quick by-election, and he'll be there, before we know it. And that's a different approach. And there's no right or wrong one, but the one I think is I think the legislature got to sitting, the majority of the year, and was it Mark Twain that used to say the only time the citizens should be truly afraid is when the legislature's sitting? I think that the legislature needs to sit from time to time, but that also be MPPs, city councillors, MPs being in their areas they represent is way more valuable in terms of both problem solving, but also learning.
Yeah, and you
about
need to
the
hear
issues.
people's stories and what they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
So you were, when you were an MPP, you represented a Peel riding.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you have any thoughts on sort of the region, and we've kind of had a back and forth conversation with the province on this. Hazel absolutely hated being part of the region appeal. Bonnie took it as a mission of hers to separate as well. And then before she passed, Hazel got a commitment from the premier, and then it kind of reversed itself over time. But we're talking about an area with 1.6, 1.7 million people, with kind of 2-3 distinct communities here, and whether or not it makes sense to continue having regional government, or if we should split.
Well,
off and
you
be
see,
single
if
tier.
you look at functions as opposed to government or as opposed
Yeah.
to politics, I mean, a lot of this, let's face it, is politics.
Yep.
And it's politics at the provincial level and politics locally, and I'm not going to wade into as between Brampton and Mississauga and so on, and Caledon. I mean, Caledon's always had opinions about itself and what it should be doing or not doing. And so, but if you look at functions of government, I would have said it makes perfect sense, let's put it that way, to have a regional police service, only because I can't believe that isn't actually more efficient and maybe deals with the reality of how policing is done on a regional basis, because there's things happening where you cross over this borderline. Transit, I would have said, well, and I know transit is delivered sort of more locally, but I've often said that taxpayers, transit riders, citizens at large, they don't know when they cross over the border between Brampton and Mississauga. They don't know. I mean, to them, they know there are two different cities. So take account of the realities of delivering service and structure government that way. As you know, for years in Toronto, there was a metro, level of government that was citywide policing and things like that, and it worked well. The provincial government of the day then decided to amalgamate it all into one big city. I think there are parts of that work very well, and there are other parts that don't. And so you're never going to find a perfect system, but I think what you should do is try to get the politics out of it and just make a decision that you're going to stay the course and just leave it as it is, if that's what you're going to do. I also get the fact that inside any region like this, Peel, there are going to be, I'll call it inequities, or there are going to be discrepancies that arise where it seems one part is subsidizing the other.
Yeah. Well, and that's what Mississauga's been saying.
And you
for a
should
long
try and
time.
fix that.
Yeah.
Like there's ways to
Yeah.
fix that. That's math.
Yeah.
So you don't need to decide you're going to have a region or not have one.
We just need the province to do it for us because we can't do it ourselves.
Well, and look, that may be one of those cases in which Premier Ford or whoever is there after him decides they will do that. But I mean, or you just leave it alone and say, look, you'll sort it out locally. And so I just think it's one of those things where it becomes hugely politicized, and then that doesn't accomplish anything.
No,
People just
no,
fight
that's
about it, they argue about it. Sometimes it's a convenient debating point to say, I'm in favor of abolishing the region of Peel, and it's a kind of rallying cry, but it really isn't anything else.
Well, I mean, we talk a lot about, and Hazel used to talk about this too, about how, we try to keep our taxes low. You were able to keep taxes low, frozen, or at the rate of inflation. We're not there right now in the city of Mississauga or the region of Peel. We're not there in the city of Toronto either. And a lot of that is from the rising costs of regional expenses. And, what Mississauga would argue is subsidizing the rest of the region as well. So, we're trying to use that and as a tool to sort of say, this is how we could balance our books. But, it's been a challenge. I know you mentioned.
I think I'll say, Alvin,
Yeah.
the bigger part of the problem is that more money is needed into the system.
Absolutely.
I mean, because I agree with you, there may be inequities, and I'm not as familiar with them between Brampton and Mississauga or whatever. But the real problem is inadequate funding of municipalities by the province, and over-reliance that was therefore created on things like development charges. And I know you've taken some steps to deal with that here, because if housing is ultimately at the top of the list, which it really should be because of the number of people that are arriving in this region, then you have to find ways to help keep housing affordable, and development charges are sort of certainly one of the targets you would pick first.
Well, and there's to our point earlier, there's not enough coordination. Like when the federal government increases, immigration rates and the province makes decisions on schools and post-secondary institutions, that has a direct effect on the municipalities, yet there's no transfer.
And no one asks either. Not even transfer the money. Nobody even asks.
Or tells us.
You read about it on the internet.
That's right.
And, I agree. And even when it comes to housing programs themselves, I mean, I think it's really a good thing that all three orders of government are back into the housing business, because there's been most times in history where you had 2 out of 3 in it and it didn't matter, like somebody was out of it.
Right.
Now we have all three governments in. The bad news is that oftentimes they each have their own program, and those programs aren't even coordinated. So you can't get maximum impact out of those programs in terms of the kind of housing you want to see built, because everybody's got their money going to a different thing. And so, we really do as a country. We've got a lot of government in this country. You have an extra level here with the region. You've got to get our act together and say, fine, if we're going to have that many governments, that's the way it's been, and probably will be, but let's at least say on housing, for example, which everybody places as a top priority, that we're going to make sure these programs are coordinated and that you do it in a way that everybody's kind of, choosing the same pathway to the goal.
It does seem to be a unique topic right now that doesn't matter your political stripe or your order of government. Everybody's rowing in the right direction.
I think that's true, but there's still this, I would say, separation of programs. And, there's the fight, for example, which I never understood. I understand it constitutionally because I'm a lawyer and I studied it in law school. But at the end of the day, if the feds want to contribute to housing and they want to do it on a city-by-city basis, yes, I understand. The Constitution says it's a provincial responsibility, and the provinces say you should be sending that money to us. But I also understand the federal government saying they want to participate. I'm happy they do, and that they will do some dealings with the city, especially where there are instances in this country, not so much here in Ontario, where the provinces refuse to be part of it, and the cities are then almost denied that money because their province says, well, we're not being part of that.
Well, and they're using the carrot approach, right? I mean, they're offering their housing accelerator fund money for policy changes at the city. So, transit-oriented development, fourplexes, which is greater than what the province was asking for.
True enough.
Right? So that was one of my motions that I put
in. And the federal election just passed. I mean, I'm nonpartisan. I mean, I really have been since I became mayor. I don't belong to a party. But I thought Mr. Carney's approach, which was the one that was the incentive approach, was better than the punishment approach that Mr. Poilievre suggested, in terms of saying, if you don't go along, municipalities, we're going to kind of withdraw money from you.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can do it either way. You end up in the same place, I guess. But I just thought the idea of having punishment as opposed to incentives was not the right way. I just think you get more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, I believe.
I would say you're a student of politics and history in Canada. You've been around for a number of different things. Have you ever seen anything like we just saw?
No.
In the federal
No,
election?
I have been literally involved. I joined the Progressive Conservative Party when I was 14, and I quickly got experience, because when you join that young, they give you stuff to do. And, so I was running campaigns like for Mayor Crombie in Toronto when I was like 20. And so I've watched a lot of campaigns and run a lot. I have never seen an instance in which there was somebody that was 25 points ahead.
Yeah.
And with like months to go. Like
Right.
it wasn't, it was
Yeah.
like 3 years to go. It was months to go.
Yeah.
And that they lost the election, albeit when you say they lost the election, I even heard Mr. Polyev talking the first time he was speaking after the election results, and he said, who would have ever thought you could get 41% of the vote and not form the government?
Right.
I mean, it was just absolutely accepted that if you got 40%, you were in.
You're good. Yeah. And
So
a majority government at that.
It's strange, but maybe it's the reality for now. And you just have to, when you're in this business, you have to adjust yourself to the reality, and that's the way it goes.
I mean, some people are talking about electoral reform. I don't know how much that would change. Are we in this sort of new normal with these two parties right now?
Who knows? You know what? Parties have been near extinction in the past.
Yeah.
I mean, you can think of examples, here where this has happened. Look at the Liberal Party. I mean, they went down to, 8 seats in the last provincial election. Now they're back up to 14, back up to 30% of the vote, more importantly. And so they're resuscitating themselves. The Conservatives provincially were, sort of down and out. And then they resuscitated themselves. Now they've won 3 straight elections. So the NDP federally, and provincially, they're both kind of struggling a bit. But I'm not one. I believe the 3-party system, with the Bloc being a bit of an outlier in Quebec alone, but the 3-party system in the rest of the country is going to be here to stay. These parties will come and go and ebb and flow. And electoral reform, I think, look, I was one who supported a ranked ballot in Toronto when I was there.
Yeah.
But these things just never happen because I think, frankly, in many cases, those who are in office sort of say, well, that's not going to help me. And so it just gets slow rolled.
Yeah.
So it just never happens. And the one time in Ontario when Dalton McGuinty brought it forward on a
referendum.
referendum was quite handily defeated. So people said, no, we don't need that. So who knows?
Yeah, it's tough.
It's a system that's worked for us. People can argue about how it works or whether it's fair or unfair. It's worked for 150 plus years in Canada, and it's like the monarchy. When I do the talk show, people will say, "Oh, the monarchy. Why do we have a king that's in England?" I heard somebody saying it the other day, and I thought, well, it seems a bit odd, but it's a system that seems to work. It seems to work. Like most of the time, it works.
Right.
So why would you tamper with it?
And it does seem like an interesting move to bring the king.
Well, I think it's actually symbolically very powerful.
Yeah.
Again, I don't think Donald Trump's going to notice because he doesn't notice much, but I think it's an assertion of a system that's working. I think the contrast of him as our head of state, whether people like that or not, reading this speech, which he will do in both languages, and doing it in that sort of calm, measured way, the words will be written by the government, will be a very powerful kind of symbol of how our system can work and does work and how we're different too. So I think it's great. I think it's and I think the system is working, and so just leave it alone.
So the Prime Minister's talking about making the Canadian economy more resilient. I mean, Toronto is obviously the center of the Canadian economy. How do you feel we can weather or are weathering what's happening with Donald Trump right now?
Well, I think we're weathering it as best we can, but there is no way you can deal with somebody, especially that's that erratic.
Yeah.
If he'd said, okay, on day one I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and then he sort of stuck to it, and we're happy that he hasn't stuck to something they said he would do. But if he was stuck to it, then you say, okay, you know what you're dealing with. The problem that we have here is that, and again, something like the film industry, which you came at, just in the last number of days, and that's a problem for Peel and for Toronto and for Vancouver, and and it could be here today and gone tomorrow. It might be he says, oh well, somebody will say, no, that's not really very feasible, and you can't really do that, and it's hurting yourselves, and so I just think that everybody just has to sort of do what they're doing, which is cooperate with each other to do what we can do here, take down the barriers, work together, and so on, which we know will actually grow our own economy.
Yep.
Diversify our trading sources, and I know Mississauga's been great over time. I mean, Hazel traveled the world, and some people were critical of that, and so did Bonnie Crombie. And I don't know about Mayor Parrish, but go and drum up new places to do business, and so we're not as reliant. We're always going to be reliant on the U.S. because that's the way it is, but we can be less reliant.
Yeah.
So I think that's all we can do, and then remain united in pushing back and trying to make sure we minimize the damage that's done by all of this. It's frustrating, but we have this region, much to the frustration of people in other parts of the country, is a powerhouse. I mean, I'm talking about Peel, Halton, York, Durham, and Toronto. It's a powerhouse. I mean, there's millions of people, a huge GDP, and so even in international terms, it's a big, powerful economy. So we can weather this, and we've got tons of smart people and a great system of public education. So if you have all that working together, it can be fine. I'm an optimist because you have to be, but I am an optimist, a genuine optimist that you go through these terrible periods either because of recession or because of a President Trump type thing or whatever, and you come out the other side and you're probably better for it, and I think that'll happen here.
One of the things we talk about, Toronto, obviously downtown Toronto is the largest economic zone in the country. The second is the area around Pearson. So the amount of activity that happens here in the entire country, it's the second largest area here, and so that's credit to the mayors past who've attracted that type of investment and created the systems for us to be successful.
But I'll say to you on that something that I regret it, because when I was the head of Civic Action before I was mayor, and Civic Action's a regional body that sort of promotes civic engagement and tries to, talk about things like this, ideas that can help us all grow and achieve social justice together. And we put together something called Toronto Global, which still exists. But there was friction between the different parts of it, as you might expect, because one group would say, well, you're getting more jobs than we are, or you're getting more attention, or the staff are spending more time. We've got to learn to get over that kind of stuff and say, look, it's all for one and one for all. I was happy. I really was. People will tell you. When I saw Mississauga land a plant because of the travel of Bonnie Crombie or Hazel McCallion off, searching these things out, or because they thought it was just the right location to be here, because I knew that if something created 200 jobs in Mississauga, the chances of some of those people living in Toronto, the chance of them hiring lawyers or accountants or suppliers or something in Toronto were very high. And so I thought it was going to benefit the region. A rising tide lifts all boats.
We're one
and
giant
we've got to get over that
region.
and sort of say we're one country and we're one region here, where we're very powerful, even within this country. You don't like to talk about flexing our muscles, but I mean, sometimes you have to. And we're very powerful here and can achieve great things, but it's going to be much better if we do it together, as opposed to all worrying about who's getting more minutes of the time of somebody that's promoting foreign investment. We just want them to invest here in the region somewhere, and anywhere is good.
Do you think the Prime Minister's right that our relationship with the U.S. is
yes? Well, because what we've learned is you can't just sit back and, which I think we did as a country. I think we did it in terms of our own productivity, including business leaders, and sort of said, well, we're doing fine here. We don't really have to worry about anything, because when you live next to a market of 350 million people, you're in pretty good shape in terms of having somebody you can sell a lot of your goods and services to. But I think we now realize that it just takes one, person that decides they have a different view about this, and is going to start imposing penalties even on us, their best friend and best, customer, to say you're too vulnerable. And so it's not going to be easy to address it, but I think it changes the relationship forever, because certainly in my lifetime, we've never really, there's been fits and starts where people have been mad at a given president for something mostly about international conflicts and stuff like that, as opposed to our relationship. But now we've seen somebody that's taken direct aim, and I think you have to sort of say, well, look, we can't allow ourselves just to be completely vulnerable in light of that happening, and we've got to change our own habits in terms of interprovincial trade, in terms of us being a strong fighting region to attract investment, and so on and so on.
It has also seemed to change people on a cultural level. Like, Canadians are now more proud to be Canadian. They're talking about it more. They're booing the American national anthem. I don't think people have been this engaged in politics and what's happening around the world.
No, I think it's true, and I think I remember back, because I was very involved in the free trade election in 1988, and people were very engaged in that, and the turnout was high, and there were strong emotions on all sides, and it ignited a lot of passion for the country, but it was strictly political. Whereas I think this goes beyond that. I think people, because the President of the United States, I'll say threatened or implied somehow that we weren't a real country. And I think a lot of people said, no, we are, and we're going to assert ourselves a bit. And it led to a very positive kind of patriotism. So I think that, this was a wake-up call, and hopefully now that engagement sustains itself so that the governments can make the changes in the interprovincial trade barriers, in the regions, working well together to sort of be out in the world seeking out business and stuff. Because that should be the kind of practical outcome. Aside from the patriotism, we've got to use it now to go and do something that's going to be of benefit to us, to make us less dependent on them.
More productive,
domestically.
And so you're a sports fan.
Totally.
I remember some iconic moments of you, especially in 2019 when the Raptors won the...
that jacket.
That jacket is amazing.
That jacket earned me a shout-out from Mick Jagger. It did. I mean, if you talk about pinnacles in your life, because I've gone to every Stones concert in the Toronto region for forever, like way, way back. And he had one north of Toronto, and it was right after the Raptors won. And he was on the stage, and of course, I didn't meet him, but he was on the stage, and he literally said on the stage, I think Mayor John Tory is here at the concert tonight. Do you think he has that terrible, wasn't it a terrible jacket, that jacket, and do you think he's had it cleaned? Which I want to note for all of the people listening to us, I did have it cleaned.
Okay.
But, people, things like that are fun, and
Who
you
made
can
that
kind
for
of help. It was I've forgotten his name. I'm embarrassed now because I should remember. And he brought it to me when I was at a public event, and he said, here's this jacket. And I looked at it, and I thought, this has to be the most garish looking thing I've ever seen. I never wear anything like this. So I just put it on one day to sort of, help get into the swing of cheering on the Raptors, and it became seen as a good luck charm, and it became seen as kind of people noticed it. So I still have it, and I wore it. And I wear it now if they make the playoffs, which unfortunately they don't that often, but they will again.
Well, if you're wearing a Leaf sweater and they win, you keep wearing the sweater, right?
Well, that's right. No, I have a Leafs jacket
Yeah.
that I have had for 2003 when I first ran for mayor. I've had it 2 years before that, so that's like 25 years.
Yeah.
I wear it all the time. I mean, I wear it even when they're not winning because, like, I mean, if you lived your whole life in the Toronto area like I have, I mean, you're a Leafs fan, period, full stop, and probably first among all the other teams because I'm a sports fan of all of our teams, genuinely.
Do you have
Has nothing
a
to do with
Jays
being there.
jacket?
Oh, for sure, of course I do. I have a
got one of
TFC
each.
jacket, a
Yeah,
Jays
okay.
jacket, an Argo jacket. I was the commissioner of the Canadian Football League, as you said. So, no, I'm a big, genuine sports fan, and I would go to watch almost any sport or would watch almost any sport on television. And I participate in some, not others. I'm not. I don't. I don't play rugby. It's a bit crazy for somebody at my stage of life, but I do play other sports. None of them to the point where I'm going to win any championships.
So how did you?
Although I should get Donald Trump to help me with golf. I gather he has like the foot wedge, and
I've heard a lot of things in terms of how he
holes in the pockets of his
keeps
Secret
winning
Service
those
people,
championships.
where a ball
Yeah.
drops down out of their pant leg.
Yeah,
And they go,
exactly.
"Oh, found it."
Yeah. So, I mean, you started as a lawyer, you were a broadcaster. I was curious how you became commissioner of the CFL.
Well, it's one of those kind of funny things like happenstance. I was the lawyer for the CFL.
Okay.
And as the lawyer for the CFL, you would attend many of their meetings because you'd be giving them advice on this or that. And so they got used to me and got to know me. And the owners of the CFL teams are all characters. You have to be rich to own a sports team to begin with, especially in the CFL where it doesn't make as much money as in the NFL, to say the least. And so they got used to me being at the meetings. And then when they were looking for a new chairman, at one stage chairman of the Board of Governors, they said, well, what about you? We know you. And, I said, okay. And so I did it because I was going to most of the meetings anyway.
Right.
And then what I hadn't done, this is a lesson for all the listeners and viewers and you as an up-and-coming, accomplished politician, which is always read the fine print. And the fine print said in the Constitution of the CFL that when the commissioner, who's like the CEO, resigns, the chairman becomes the commissioner.
Okay.
And it's meant to be only for a stopgap. It's like having an acting mayor if somebody goes off to run somewhere else or whatever. But in my case, I happened to become the acting commissioner at a time when the league was in serious trouble, and there was a lot of work to be done restructuring, and I was doing it all as a volunteer.
Right.
And the commissioner gets paid very well in this country as a CEO, and so they liked the fact that I was free, and they liked the fact that I seemed to be helping them to restructure. So I did it for 4 years, the commissioner's job, for free. Well, I said $1 a year, but I've never been paid the dollar, so they owe me $4.
$34
Plus
yeah.
massive accumulated interest.
Yeah.
But having said that, I was pleased to do it because I think we have far too few of these Canadian institutions that still exist, and this is a Canadian game and it's a Canadian institution. But that's how it happens. So it is a lesson about reading the fine print.
So as we wrap up, I just kind of wanted to ask you what were kind of your favorite moments as mayor?
Well, my favorite moments were all fit into two categories, and I'm sure you understand and relate to this. And people will find the answer to be different than what they expect. They'd say, well, cutting the ribbon on some giant project. Like, when we went to open the Spadina subway extension I referred to earlier, it was very proud and people were thrilled about that. And they tend to forget very quickly about how long it took to do it because they can put their behind in a seat and go somewhere. The moments to me were moments of seeing the joy in the faces of people when you would show up to their event because they found showing up to their event, especially when it came to cultural events that celebrated people's roots and so on, that it was recognition. It was respect and recognition, and that you realized how much, that they thought they were seen by the mayor, and there were others. I wasn't there alone, but when the mayor would come, they would see that as a form of recognition. So those were moments of great satisfaction to me, and I had a lot of fun, and they made me, like, I'm a notoriously poor dancer, but I would go to Salsa on St. Clair, which is a sort of a Latin event every year, and every year for 9 years I was mayor, I danced badly on the stage at Salsa and at Caravana every year, and there are tapes, videos on the internet to this day of me dancing at Caravana, the Caribbean Carnival, badly. But I did it because I knew they got a kick out of the fact that I would come and celebrate with them, and even though I couldn't dance worth a hoot, that I would dance nonetheless. So that's category one. And then the second category, and I know you know this, and I was saying it to somebody yesterday, the tiny things you do for people that involve one phone call, and they call you in distress about something because it's a small thing, but it's government, and they're just kind of saying, oh my God, like whatever it is, I can't get the piece of paper I need to do something or whatever. And of course, there are many, many, many of those, and many of them are handled by your staff, but many of them are handled by you as well as an elected representative. And I found those moments to be the moments of the most satisfaction out of politics because you saw how happy those people were. The government had screwed up, and then they're thanking you profusely for the fact you fixed this problem that never should have existed. And I found those moments just, incredibly heartwarming because it sort of told you that you can make a real difference to those people. And of course, they add up over time, that you've solved problems for those people. And that's what you're there to do, ultimately. I mean,
Absolutely.
make big decisions and have big projects and do this and do that. But in the end, you're there to make sure people's lives can be made a bit better and a bit easier. And so when you can actually do that, you're satisfied with that.
Yeah, and I find most people in politics are doing that for the right
Oh,
reasons.
they are. Look, I'm not one of those, and it's especially liberating to be a nonpartisan. I think 95% of people, maybe even a little higher, but 95% of people are in it for all the right reasons. Everybody, they have different ways of showing it, but I think there are very few people who are in it to, fill their own pockets. And unfortunately, and I don't think that view is really very prevalent in the public either. I think public, the number of people who come up to me in the street, even now, a couple of years after I left, and thank me for my service. And I think they're saying to themselves, well, better he or she is doing it than me. Like, I wouldn't want to do that because it's a hard job. They know that. Yeah. And so they're thankful you do it. They know you do your best and that there's the odd time when somebody doesn't. But I think most people are more respectful of politicians than they let on.
Well, and I find the municipal level is the level that has the most direct engagement and the ability to help people.
Well, and they see you.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the difference.
You're
And I'm
more
not being
accessible.
critical of federal or provincial politicians, but they have to be in Ottawa or at Queen's Park.
Right.
And also what they do is not as visible. When you're solving problems that people have at their own home, on their own street, every day. And if you look at the problems you solve federally, it may have to do with the education system. Or if it's federally, it may be a passport or immigration. And those are important matters, but they're not sort of at the same touch and feel daily kind of reality for people. And so that's why I think the main reason is they know their local politicians because they see them all the time. Yeah. You see them in the community. Even if you're mayor of a big city like Mississauga or Toronto, you're seen as the mayor all the time by people here and there. And whereas that's not true, the federal people are often, in Ottawa a lot of the time, and I admire that in them because I'm not sure I'd want to be doing that, being out of town all the time.
Right.
So
it's tough.
Yeah,
it's tough. So I do want to thank you. I want to thank you for your service and all your time helping people and all the advocacy you've done over your careers. And I do want to leave with a fun fact.
I'm not dead yet.
No. And I hope you stay
I'll continue
involved.
to be an advocate. No, but I'll continue to be an advocate because I think if you don't speak up, especially if you have the experience to sort of have a legitimate point of view, you should use your voice.
Absolutely.
And I will.
And you're on the radio, and you and I have done some shows together as well, and so I hope you continue that as well. But I do want to say this one point because I think it's indicative of people's faith in you and their trust in you and their confidence in your leadership. Your 479,659 votes in 2018 is the single most number of votes that any individual in Canada has ever received in any given election. And over your 4 elections as mayor and 3 as MPP, I am 100% certain that you've received more votes as an individual in this country than any Canadian in history.
It could be. I don't look up
No,
those things.
there's
But you know what?
there's no question.
It is interesting because in municipal politics, as you know, and as I know, they're voting for a person.
Yeah.
There are no parties, and so they're voting for the person, and that puts more of a focus on you. Because we know in the last federal election or the last provincial election, a lot of people voted for the party or for the leader, and the local representative was the beneficiary of that. But they didn't vote for them. I mean, they voted for them too, but it was all divided up.
Yeah.
And so it's a sort of humbling thing, and it makes you feel a greater sense of responsibility. But it's also a reason why mayors should exercise that mandate and be allowed to do so without people saying you shouldn't do that. What entitles you to do that? The answer is I got votes from right across the city from people who elected me to this office, and so I should make sure I do as best I can to advance the best interests of the city. So, but anyway, thank you for recognizing that. And it's one of those things that'll be in the dustbin of history, or somebody else will surpass it because the cities are growing.
It's one of those stats that someone like Steve Paikin would enjoy.
Yeah, he would. He would.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming out to
for having me.
Mississauga.
I appreciate it very much, and I look forward to being here again. It's a great city, and it's growing like gangbusters. That means people want to live here.
That's right.
And so that's the ultimate litmus test. They could live a lot of places in this country, or the U.S., or anywhere, Europe. They want to live here.
Thank you to John once again for coming on the InCamera podcast. If you have any questions or suggestions for the show, please email me at alvin.tejo@mississauga.ca. Don't forget to like and subscribe and share this episode with your friends. We'll see you next time.